All right. As Richie said, I'm Ricarda Bigolin from RMIT in Melbourne. I'm an Associate Dean and an Associate Professor. I think I have various projects and research that I do in upcycling, but today with the theme on Australia, I wanted to connect to some historical research that I've been doing around upcycling. The title of the research is called Upcycling as Precarity and Invention in Historical Australian Clothing and Material Practice. And the research really goes about that upcycling is not a new strategy to prolong the use of clothes within fashion. Historically, various upcycling strategies have always been used to produce clothes for longer use. In historical Australia, conditions of precarity and remoteness during periods of major global events meant upcycling was often used to extend the life use of clothes. The period explored in the research includes colonial Australia in the 19th century and interwar periods after World War II in the 20th century. Relationships between colonisation, globalisation and fashion are therefore explored in this research. Fashion emerged in the 19th century as a complex industrial system based on steadily growing, unsustainable and untenable production systems as part of colonisation. Australia was settled as a British colony in the later part of the 18th century. Clothing practices were imported into Australia as part of colonisation. These global events, such as colonisation, world wars and depressions, established the origins of upcycling, particularly within fashion, as practices of precarity and invention. The research asserts upcycling offers potent ways for us to understand enforced modes of previous use, provenance, and socio-political conditions that make it a necessity. Post-colonial and decolonial critique may also suggest that contemporary practices of upcycling are a necessity now due to the ongoing impacts of Eurocentrism and globalisation. The relationship with colonisation and waste and overproduction is a necessary element that contemporary practice must face. I'll also acknowledge a content warning that there might be for First Nations people of Australia and other lands, references made to names or representations of deceased persons in this presentation that could be culturally sensitive as part of this challenging relationship of colonisation. As I am presenting to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia, before I will proceed, I'll give an acknowledgement of country. This research asserts that the discipline of fashion is a Western construct and highly dictated by place, land ownership, colonisation, exploitation of people and destruction of land and natural resources. Australian dress historian Margaret Maynard, in the seminal work Fashion from the Penury, notes that during the settlement in Australia from the 18th century, the country's original inhabitants were systematically dispossessed from the land. What was at first a military prison was transformed into a fully organised capitalist society. All inhabitants were issued with British dress. These were loose-fitting, coarse and ready-made dresses supplied to them. Therefore, Western dress was enforced onto the traditional inhabitants as part of colonial rule. Negating the relevance of other forms of dress and clothing practice, essential to recognise as part of post-colonial critique and ongoing decolonisation. Symbolically, fashion, dress and clothing practices are potent symbols of colonisation and must be addressed and acknowledged as part of reconciliation. I acknowledge my role as a white researcher of European descent that seeks to better decolonise my own understanding of the history of fashion. And in doing so, I acknowledge and pay my respects to the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands I conduct the business of the university. I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors, elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. It's important to assert the ties between colonisation, globalisation are the results of overproduction or a surplus of goods that leads to waste, exploitation of people and planet, and therefore a predicament of need to make from used things or waste as part of upcycling. According to Young, Colonisation involved the subjectation of one people by another, of women, of slaves, of minorities, of the poor, of relatively powerless sovereign peoples, of resources of the earth, maintaining that as long as there's oppressive power remains, colonialism remains relevant to the problems we face today. Australia was colonised by British rule and as part of the second phase of colonisation in the 18th and 19th century. Jansen, quoting Vasquez, defines decoloniality as being grounded on the possibility of discriminating other knowledges as being non-existent, backward, belonging to the absent path, or mythical, and thus denying their role as legitimate sources of experience. And now, so I'm going through this quite quickly. I'm just trying to set some background. I won't go through this very extensive timeline, but this timeline is a very potted timeline that seeks to deal with very many things and taking a decolonial perspective, trying to trace the relationships of the evolution of industrial fashion, and even going today where we see some impacts and some policies implemented to counter the waste and the production of fashion from the start, where we see, you know, the evolution of fashion came out of the industrial age, and during that time that fashion was evolving as this big enterprise, that also involved the time where colonies were settled, including Australia, including the systematic genocide of First Nations owners, the gold rush in Australia, which meant more and more people were going to these colonies. And I think that's a really interesting thing to trace when we talk about fashion. At the same time, there's innovations in machine production, spinning wheels, the Singer sewing machine, that's happening before things like World War I, the Great Depression. And these moments, some of these moments I touch on later when I talk about these specific historical precedents of upcycling. So I won't touch on them all here, but there's just to kind of gloss over this very kind of complex timeline of what is happening. But suffice to say, according to Seaman, colonialism is not a thing of the past. It is a fashion industry reality. So this is what is sort of setting this scene of why we're talking about colonization and something like upcycling that predominantly deals with waste in various forms. I'll move on and I can come back to this because it's a little bit complicated, but I'll get to instead talking about the methodology of the research. So the research primarily explores an exploration of upcycling and uses colonial replica costumes from a living museum, Sovereign Hill, a few hours outside of Naarm, Melbourne. The project includes collaboration with PhD researcher Chantal Kirby. This particular museum preserves the dress practices of the time, depicting the gold rush of the 1850s. It really shows how the limited materials of the time fostered extended life use, circularity, secondhand economies of clothes. So in Australia, it was a very unique context because of the remoteness from other parts of Europe. There's very different approaches taken on. So what I'm trying to do here is really ground the practices of upcycling at this particular point in time, where things like expending use, repair, mending and refurbishment were just all part of the practice. So we've been doing fieldwork and interviews at this living museum to sort of get a sense of these practices. So they preserve and replicate the practices of this particular point in time. We've used things like object analysis, wear and performance testing with participants of the costume replicas to get an understanding of what these strategies are. And we've also been using creative practice studies of upcycling found in these costumes to really understand different forms of these strategies of upcycling. The other part of the research that I touch on today is examples from various other Australian archives containing unique material and clothing approaches to the colonial period, but the interwar period. And creative practice studies continue as part of this ongoing research to really understand more deeply these practices and the role of upcycling. So there's various, I think, slippages in the usage of the term upcycling, which I always like to define, and I think it's an important part of this particular research. Because the question is, what really are the material and value flows that occur when a material is upcycled? There is a suggestion of the augmentation of value in upcycling, a transformation of expended materials in something of more worth. Defined as a strategy to reduce environmental impact, upcycling combines circular material flows of products and materials and slower consumption cycles. Historically, this wasn't considered a strategy of upcycling per se, but basically good practice and ethics in making clothes well with durability and preciousness of materials in mind. I've always found in upcycling practices that there's been an inherent relationship with downcycling, particularly about a change of function. And I quote Taylor from 2015, who describes downcycling for clothing when an item finishes its role as a functional item for the body. So when it's no longer worn on the body and takes on other functions. These slippages are important as they also delve deeper into the meaning of these practices. This is an example here of some early creative practice studies where we are upcycling painters' rags that have been downcycled as part of the current production system of fashion to expend another possible value of rags beyond their clothes. These studies illustrate these ideas. The rags were once clothes but were unwanted. If we use them now to reclaim their original material provenance, what values occur? So these creative practice studies we've done adjacent to looking at archives and field works to really understand these different kind of slippages of what we really understand as upcycling as a practice. It became evident that in the colonies, precarity of materials meant various forms of upcycling and downcycling occurred regularly. So as part of looking at this, we've looked at different kind of museums across Australia and have been able to find some quite rare examples of these different kind of foundations of upcycling. In this particular example, dresses were made with the capacity to be remodelled as part of good practice. The practices of downsizing once a garment wears out for a smaller item is part of this particular time period due to the limitations of accessing materials on a very remote place in the world. This example actually shows a blurring between upcycling and downcycling, particularly with Taylor's notion in mind. As the original women's dress loses its function for the original purpose, it takes on the same function on a smaller scale. So this is a child's dress that's cut from a woman's dress and remodeled on the same style. So this was commonly done from early mid-19th centuries within Australia as a practice just to use materials up. And a common practice as part of it, so this downscaling, and this practice has been written about in a few examples, but this is an actual example of the work in the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney. This practice is often later taken up as part of the broader Make, Do and Mend initiatives that happened during World War II and the interwar periods, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. This image is from a booklet from the curriculum of RMIT University, was previously part of many other colleges, including Emily Macpherson, which was a school for women. And this was a booklet issued by the Commonwealth, which gave forward many different various ideas around Make, Do and Mend initiatives, and this specifically related to an Australian context. It describes ways of using old clothes to make new ones and emphasises the values of this work. So this particular school was actually collaborated with the Commonwealth, and this guidebook was part of the curriculum that people studied to learn how to do this. So this was happening in 1942 during World War II. And this time period really forced agency to consumers, which is something that when we're talking about upcycling now in fashion, we've got a loss of skill and agency of the consumers that we're sort of talking to. So this was a very different time period where everyone was tasked with upcycling or making things from old things, if you will. So and similar tactics are really kind of emerging around rapidly. We see this kind of around. And also with the burgeoning changes to closing production loops, material flows. So instead of buying new, remaking. So this happened at a time of complete precarity where there was, no resources to use because all of the resources were being kind of pulled to support the World War II. And this really instills that kind of idea. And you can see here these were students from the school, but they're wearing the upcycled men's suits in women's suits with the directions in these very kind of detailed booklets on how to actually do this practice, that was given and dispersed, I think, very publicly. Another historical example I will refer to today is derived from the bushman's blanket and the possum skin cloak of Indigenous Australians. My previous mention about the contact warning for First Nation people of any of First Lands people just is relevant here also, just with the depiction of potentially someone who is deceased. Possum skin cloaks involve the quilting together of a complete possum hide. So this was part of Indigenous clothing and dress practices when Australia was settled. So when settlers arrived to Australia in the 19th century, Bushmen were inspired by this practice. So they actually started to mimic this practice. And instead of using possum skins that were pieced together as full possum skins, they used worn blankets and fashioned them into cloaks. This is a unique practice to Australia, occurring around, prior to the interwar periods and the Depression. And I really think this reference to possum skin cloaks also is very particular to Australia, and also decolonising the lineage of historical dress practices for Australia. The skins were patched together with loose blanket or running stitches without wasting any of the pelts. So it relates to this particular item, which is not actually called a quilt. It's unique to Australia. It's called a wagga. And the wagga involves, inspired also by the possum skin quilt, was born out of necessity and the desperate times in the interwar periods from 1890s to 1930s. It was made originally from Bushmen just actually piecing together old jute wheat sacks and wool bales to make a covering instead of clothing that was not an option during some of those times within an Australian context that's so remote from the more kind of larger industrialised European cities of the time. It involved, it sort of started to evolve. Also, women replaced the rough jute sacks with calico flower bags, fabric swatches, and bits of old clothes, which you can see in this image. In this example of a traditional wagga, the front layer has clothing and panels of mismatched materials. So these were really just pieced together with items that they had of clothing that was worn out and pieced together to form this wagga. And this one in particular is a Depression era one. And the pieces within it are knitted garments, panels from a skirt, a panel from a trouser, sleeveless knitted vests, a knitted blanket, all stitched together with string, and also using sometimes things like buttons as well. Wagga is also derived from the Aboriginal language of the city of Wagga Wagga, which also means crow, but also might also mean dance. So this particular interesting approach to upcycling, I think, out of necessity is a very interesting one. That has this capacity for us to really look differently of the provenance of these materials, but also how we think of use when we're talking upcycling. This is another example from the Depression era of waggas within Australia. So again, yes, it is like a quilt, but it contains full pieces of garments that have been garments that have worn out, that aren't used anymore, and that instead are pieced together to be this very precious item that's actually passed down in generations. So this particular one was a wedding gift, I believe, and usually they have a very long lifespan, these blankets, and they sort of really can then get more clothing added to them. But a very specific Australian example of this approach that happened, particularly in those interwar periods where there was no capacity to get anything in from Europe or from other countries, which I think is just a really interesting foundation for how we might think of upcycling in fashion. So the creative practice examples that I have produced in collaboration with PhD researcher Chantal Kirby, these are happening alongside this, this historical research that we're doing, this research into the colonial, unique Australian practices that really are kind of foundational upcycling practices in fashion. And in this case, we are also playing with and examining upcycling and downcycling and how they kind of work together. And by that, these particular examples show the use of downcycled painter's rags. So for anyone that doesn't know, you can readily buy them. Commissioned, their trims have been removed, they've been shredded into pieces and used for painter's rags when they're an appropriate cellulosic fabric. So these then are kind of put together as these things that people buy. So I thought that was also a really interesting thing to look at, because this also shows the relationship with colonization, because we see a complete expending of the resources of the rags. So we see, another use for the clothing emerge in terms of that downcycling path. And in our work, we wanted to play with that. So we wanted to take those downcycled rags and then upcycle them by piecing them back together and looking at some of the different principles that we had observed across the different areas, how we can actually pull these back together and how we can piece them back together and think through their provenance, what the materials do, and embody some of the principles of their particular areas that we've been looking at. These definitely were kind of responding to those colonial dress styles by not cutting into them. So the rags were not cut into, they were gathered and folded. We were also looking at the provenance of materials by trying to arrange them back into colours, but also, and for people that don't know, these come in random allotments of colours. So we sorted all of these rags and kind of identified them, or they come in white blocks or black blocks of rags. So the process is quite interesting in putting these together. And addressing some of the things that we had observed in some of the examples that we had been looking at. So I think these studies also, this as a study reflects on the surplus of production that's come, that we have so much of a surplus of things that we have to then often, these rags are often shipped around the world to be produced, cleaned, sorted and decommissioned, and then shipped back into Australia to be produced and consumed and bought as rags. So I'm conscious of time, and I think I'm almost right on time. I feel I've sped through this just to be very conscious of the many presentations to follow and not to use too much time, but I will kind of wrap up. I know I've gone through a few complex things in a very fast amount of time, but I will kind of conclude here, and hopefully I can touch on things if there are any questions. The creative practice examples I've shown, so they're just a part of many different creative practice examples, and that we do as part of research in analysing upcycling, particularly in fashion. It really has been about looking at how we can analyse these materials, how we really understand what upcycling is, this process of material flows, this change of value and function. And also like what this kind of, what this means. And this is another example of, a study that was all based on white rags, where things were where we sort, wash, fold, arrange, and really analyze what these things are doing and the ages of garments and items that you might find in that. And suffice to say within this that, these historical examples that I've mentioned today really embody kind of upcycling as good practice in clothing and material, not something different. It actually should be a part of fashion practice as we know it, not something that we have to add back on. So our role now, I think, as academics, practitioners, is to actually build in to design and the production of fashion the capacity to upcycle, the capacity for a garment to be upcycled in actually really different ways. Hopefully I've kind of sketched some very different approaches here within these historical examples that I feel haven't had much kind of discussion in relationship to upcycling. And I think that that's part of what we need to enforce into practice. And it's about that idea of how we might better design for potential in upcycling rather than just dealing with the problem that we have at the moment. And hopefully I've shown also this trajectory of how upcycling has become a part of globalization. It's something that we've had to do due to the correlations between globalization and, in this context, fashion and colonization. So with that, I might leave it, and thank you very much. I think I'm right on time. Thanks.